Welcome, Panther family. This week's Five Questions Friday needed to be different this week. The Alumni Association and I recognize that our country is in a struggle. That struggle is for understanding, for learning, and most importantly, justice. And so, one of the most important things right now, specifically for white people, is to learn and to listen. I know I'm not going to get and say everything right, but I'm not going to let that fear of fumbling or saying the wrong thing prevent me from learning and opening myself up to that type of knowledge that can really open up this discussion and help people understand the situation better. I think one of the most powerful ways to learn and understand is to listen to the experience of a person who does not look like you or someone who might identify differently from you. But I do recognize that storytelling is a burden that is placed squarely on the shoulders of people who are already exhausted by the indirect or the direct, the conscious or the unconscious biases and discriminations that happen daily. That is why I and we owe a huge debt of gratitude to my friend and colleague, a UNI athletic director, David Harris. David and I had a socially distanced driveway talk yesterday, kind of discussing like how we can thoughtfully enter this conversation. And he said he was willing to share his personal story. So David, thank you so much for your willingness to talk to us.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for doing this. I think it's important to have these conversations at any time, but certainly during a time like we're all living through now. And so I appreciate the opportunity to be able to share, but mostly I appreciate you and the Alumni Association being willing to tackle this subject area and provide a platform to be able to speak.
Excellent. So one of my first questions is how and when did you first learn about race?
You know, that's a challenging question for me because as an African American, I can never remember a time when I wasn't aware of it. I mean, clearly there was a time when it wasn't at the forefront of my mind, but it was such an ingrained thing in my family, in my house. So when I think back to being my son's age, my son is 9. When I think back to being his age, it feels like it was just something that was an ingrained part of the culture of how we lived every day, the conversations that we had around our dinner table, and thinking about how being African American made our experience in this country different and what that meant. Now, it's interesting. One of the first real conversations I can remember having, and I was even younger than my son Wesley now, not just in our home, but really as a nation. You know, I grew up in the 70s and 80s. So in the late 70s, I want to say in 77, the miniseries Roots came out. And that was, I won't say the first time, but it was one of those times when people of all colors gathered around their TV and viewed this story that many had never had the perspective or taken the time to be able to view before. And so it was really groundbreaking at the time, and it sparked conversations that happened in my home and in homes across the country just about the history of African Americans coming to this country, the things that we've endured over a period of time, and the things that we continue to endure. So I think when that happened, that heightened maybe the conversations that were happening in and around me with my parents, with my older sisters, with other people in our community. But ultimately, as an African American, and it feels like something that's been so much a part of my experience that I can't remember the exact conversation or the exact time when these conversations started in my life. It just feels like it's always been there. It's always been an ingrained part of my experience. It's always been a part of the conversation. And it's really been about, okay, now that you're an African American, you're here, you're in America, You're growing up. What do you need to know? How do you need to conduct yourself? How do you make sure that you're put in a position to be able to achieve? And quite frankly, how do you make sure that as much as possible, you're not putting yourself in danger? You're not putting yourself in danger with the police. How are you not putting yourself in danger to be accused of something that you haven't done? How are you putting yourself to not have your life be threatened? And so that became part of my experience at a very young age.
So would you tell us the first moment, or maybe even the most poignant moment, where you were treated differently and experienced the act of racism?
You know, it's funny, I was telling somebody about this the other day. I can remember being about my son's age. I was maybe 8. And I remember I grew up in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, so it was hot. It was the summer. And I jumped on my bike and rode about a mile away from my house to a local snowball stand. And so I remember getting off my bike and going up, and it was just a little shack, just big enough for one person to be in there with an ice machine and all the different liquids to make snowballs. And so I remember getting off my bike, and there was one person ahead of me in the line. There was a woman, maybe she was in her 30s or so, and she was holding a child in her arms. He was a boy, but a relatively big boy. He's probably, I'm gonna guess, maybe 3 or 4 years old, and I was 8. And so I'm standing in the line behind this woman holding her child, and the child, you know, I remember she was holding him, and his shoulder, his head was right on her shoulder, and he was looking down. And then he raises his head and looks at me, and just out of nowhere, he points and calls me the N-word. And, you know, so I'm 8, and this kid is 3 or 4. And just for no reason, just out of nowhere, almost kind of like, look, there's a N-word. And the parent responded by putting the child down on the ground and spanking him at the time, and telling him he was wrong to say that. But even at 8 years old, I can remember thinking, you're spanking the child, but he's like 3. Where did he learn that from? Right? You would think he would have to have learned that language in your home. So don't put on the show for me. Don't spank your child in front of me because you're trying to make this point of disciplining him. Because even at that young age, I had a pretty good sense that he probably heard you say that word. And that's why he thinks it's okay. And so, you know, you hear people talk about hatred being a learned thing. You're not born viewing people as being different. And I think that's an example of it, because most children come into the world, all children come into the world innocent and ready to be around and play with and spend time with anybody who's nice to them, you know, no matter what they look like. And they only learn about hatred and biases and racism by people that they're around, whether families or friends or communities or neighborhoods. And it can start at a really young age, and it grows and it turns into some of the hatred that is really infecting our society right now. And so that's my earliest recollection of it. I still think about that situation to this day. I don't think I even told my parents about it. It was one of those deals where it happened. I went in and got my snow cone and got on my bike and went back home, and I thought about it for the rest of the day and many days after that. And I never was really sure what I should do with that, where I should take that. What do you do when you're 8 and somebody calls you the N-word for no reason? And what do you do when it's a child? I mean, it's not like I can beat the kid up. I mean, if it was somebody my age, I guess we could have gotten into a fight and I could have taken my anger out in that situation. But what do you do when it's a child? There was just nothing to do except sit and grapple with that hurt. And it's a hurt that really never goes away.
Right. I don't know if a lot of our Panther family knows, but you played football at Ole Miss. And during that time, their mascot was Colonel Reb, and a lot of Confederate flags in the stands. So would you talk a little bit about your experience playing there?
Yeah, here's the interesting thing. I had a great experience at Ole Miss. I was there for 13 years as a student athlete, undergraduate student, graduate student, and then I worked on campus for 7 years. So I love Ole Miss. I consider it to be a second home. But that's not to say that there weren't significant issues. And in many ways, it was a microcosm of society, because for me, I would tell you I had a good experience, but it was an experience that was without issues. People call them microaggressions now. That was present, but even I guess what you would call macroaggressions, things that were much more in your face that you had to deal with. It was a confusing time because there were things that I saw that were completely at odds with each other. I think about the experience that I had and the way that people treated me, which was overwhelmingly positive, and the way that people helped me and did things, which was overwhelmingly positive. But then I compare that to, I think about my freshman year, there was a big incident on campus because there was a fraternity that during their rush process decided as a prank to take some of their pledges and drive them about 30 miles north of Ole Miss. There's the small, predominantly Black private college called Russ College. They decided to strip them naked, drop them off on the campus, and spray paint "We Hate N-Words" and KKK on their bodies, and leave them on the campus and then drive away. So what do you say when you're on a campus that welcomes you, but then does that? Or my fraternity, Phi Beta Sigma fraternity, I joined in 1993. So I've been a member for 27 years. The year before I arrived on campus in 1989, so that would have been 1988, Phi Beta Sigma was scheduled to have the first fraternity house on Fraternity Row. Someone set it on fire and burned it to the ground. And so they ended up putting the fraternity into a different fraternity house on Fraternity Row. But at the same time, many people may have heard or may not have heard about the story of Chucky Mullins, a football player that I played with who was injured in 1989 making a tackle homecoming weekend against Vanderbilt University, in which he broke his neck and was paralyzed from the neck down. And the community responded to that in such a phenomenal way. Chucky was a African-American defensive back from Russellville, Alabama. And he went into the hospital and went through all of the treatments to try to help himself get better. The community responded by raising hundreds of thousands of dollars. I can remember football games after that where they were passing buckets up and down the aisle and everybody was giving money. There was enough money collected to buy a house for Chucky's family on campus. And if you watch Ole Miss games now on TV, football games, you'll see that when they come out at the beginning of the game, there's a bust right outside of where they run out of. And it's a bust of Chucky. And they've established the Chucky Mullins Courage Award and just done a lot of things around his memory and around his support. His number is still worn by players every year. It's awarded to a different player each year. So there was just a lot of love, a lot of understanding. Chucky became a son of our community. So what do you do when you have a community that has Colonel Reb as a mascot or has Confederate flags in the stands? You know, when I played, the stands were full of Confederate flags. Dixie was a song that was that the band played during that time period. And so there was always this confusion and this comparison between the way that you felt you were being treated on an everyday basis and the symbols that surrounded you. There was always this confusion between the way that you were being treated on the everyday basis and what was just below the surface. You know, if there was a protest, if there was an issue, if there was something that would bring out this anger or bring out this hatred that you didn't experience on an everyday basis. And so as an 18, 19, 20-year-old student athlete, it can be confusing. It can be difficult. You didn't always necessarily know if people were dealing with you in a way that was genuine. But at the same time, people were incredible. They were helpful. They were very nice. They were very supportive, and I had a very good experience. And so in many ways, my experience at Ole Miss is very similar to my experience as a Black man in America. There's no place that I would rather live. There's no place that I've had a better opportunity, could have a great opportunity. Friends, family, opportunity, just so many things that have been critical in my life that make me love this country. But that doesn't mean that I haven't had my fair share of hatred and bigotry and things that have happened in my life or the lives of people that I know and care about that don't impact my experience. And so in many ways, I see that as being very similar.
So a lot of feelings and opinions surrounding George Floyd's murder last Monday and the ensuing protests and later riots. What are you feeling? What are you thinking about watching all of this unfold?
Man, what am I not feeling? Depression, sadness, frustration, anger, just you name it. Why does this keep happening? And are we still talking about what many people describe as being bad apples in a police force? Are we talking about something more deliberate and systemic? We've seen enough of these now over the past half a dozen years to where these are not one-offs. This is a pattern in many places across the country. But more importantly, I think people have to have the perspective that this has been going on for forever, since African Americans were brought to this country. And certainly as time has gone on, the only thing that's different now versus maybe when my parents were coming up or when I was coming up is that we have the technology to be able to videotape these things. There are body cameras. There are a lot of things that show what African Americans have been talking about for years, but could never prove. Now, that is not to say that things are not better, because in many ways they're substantially better. And that's not to say that there aren't good people in law enforcement, because there are outstanding people in law enforcement. And by and large, law enforcement and the men and women who serve so bravely and sacrifice so much and put themselves in danger do a fantastic job of defending the rights of so many. But I think we've seen enough of these incidents, whether now or prior to now, to be able to say that there's a pattern of behavior between law enforcement and people of color that has to change. It's not healthy, and it's killing us. It is literally killing us. In my mind, I have etched the former police officer kneeling on the neck of George Floyd for 10 minutes with his hand in his pocket and a smirk on his face. And I'm thinking, what can be going through your mind? What can you be thinking about? And what are the other officers doing? Why is nobody stopping this? Imagine the kind of despair that you have to be in to be a grown man and be calling for your mother. Hearing him say that he can't breathe. Why is that not taken more seriously? Why are we not seen as men, as people who have families, have children, have spouses, have lives that have value and that matter? Why is that not part of the equation? Why wasn't it a part of the equation for him and for so many others that have been put in that situation? So when I see the protests that occur, I understand and I agree, and we have to use our voices to get out and make sure people understand that this is not acceptable. This is not who we are as America. This is not who we are as Americans. And that we have to stand up, and it takes people of all races and all ethnicities to make this change. And not just people that look like me, people that look like you, because it's unfair to ask people of color to solve racism. Racism is something that's done to us. It's not something that we're doing to ourselves. So you can't put us in a room and then expect us to come up with a solution to this. This is something that's happening to us and something that has to stop. And I know that people talk about, there's peaceful protests, and then there are people that have taken advantage of the situation and use it to loot or to cause violence. And that's certainly something that I do not condone. But I understand the anger. I understand the frustration behind it. But most importantly, maybe the most important thing I can say is we cannot let, whether you're black, brown, white, male, female, whatever, do not let the anger or the things that you see some people doing that are not right attract your attention away from what happened to George Floyd and what's happened to a number of other Black men in situations that are very similar. Because that's what happens sometimes. We get caught up in talking about, yeah, it's not right that people are rioting, it's not right that people are looting, and all of a sudden you find yourself in a conversation about the right or wrong that occurs after the incident has occurred. When what you really have to focus on is the incident that occurred. Keep your focus on that. Keep your anger on that. Keep your mind on that and how you can do more to make a better situation for everybody. So honestly, Leslie, I'm struggling. I know my family is struggling. I know that there are a lot of people that I know who are struggling with all of this. We want to find a way to make things better. We want to be a part of a solution. But we're feeling so much anger and so much frustration and so much despair that this continues to happen. And we have to stop it, and we have to make it stop.
Absolutely. Is there anything else you want to share with our Panther family?
I guess two things. One, I'm honored to have the chance to be able to be here, to be director of athletics, to be given this opportunity and to work with so many phenomenal people in our community. And I feel privileged to be in this position. But part of being in this position for me is being able to use my voice and being able to use my platform to speak out on things that are right and aren't right. And that could be in defense of our student athletes. It could be in defense of the LGBTQ community. It could be in defense of racial disparities or anything. But certainly as an African-American man, and to be in charge of a department where we have people of color, young people of color, it's my responsibility to speak up when I feel like there are things that are happening that are wrong in our community or wrong within our state or wrong within our country. That's something that I take as seriously as I take my commitment to leading the department in the best way that I possibly can. The second thing that I would say is you hear a lot of people talk about the nature of the protests that happen after situations occur. Our country has a long line of protests that have occurred in order to get equal rights for people of color. And by and large, none of them have really been accepted. I think about Dr. King with nonviolent protests that resulted in him being assassinated. I think about the two Olympians, John Carlos and Tommy Smith, who stood on the Olympic stand and put their fists in the air during the national anthem, and what happened to them and the way that their medals were stripped and what happened to their lives. I think about Colin Kaepernick, who simply took a knee on a football field to protest just this: racial inequality and police brutality. And he lost his career in doing that. And so we've had peaceful protests, and even those are ones that people have found reason to have an issue with. And so before you look at the things and say, well, I have an issue with the things that I'm seeing on TV and the violence and all of that, understand nobody condones that, and I certainly don't. But it's hard to know what to do when no method of protest seems to be an acceptable thing. So in many ways, you have to get beyond what other people think are acceptable and do what you think is effective and impactful. And so I stand with our student athletes, Black, white, brown, all ethnicities, anybody who is interested in getting the hatred and inequality out of our country. I want to be a part of that. I want to support them, and I want to provide a platform within athletics that they feel supported, they feel comfortable, they feel like their voices can be heard and they can effect positive change. So I'm privileged to be in this position, but like any of us who are in a leadership position, and especially if you're an African American, I think you have an extra responsibility to try to use your platform to the good of all people, and certainly to the good of people that you know have been negatively impacted by the things that can occur in our country.
Thank you so much, David, for sharing that and taking the time to share your story. I know I told you yesterday, I know that's a burden to place on you, and I am sorry you're shouldering that burden, but I am so thankful for you and your willingness to talk about this, because I think it's important that we get your story out, we get other people of color's story out. So hopefully this starts a conversation, and the conversation continues until we, maybe we don't need these conversations anymore. But thank you for starting that process with me, and hope some good comes out of this.
Thank you, Leslie. I appreciate the time and the opportunity.
Thank you.